Great. How I think drug developers can take steps to try to mitigate what I see as some of the challenges. And I'm really going to focus on three key points. First, from the standpoint of regulation, the FDA, I think that the breakthrough therapies pathway is actually quite significant. I think that it's being underappreciated, certainly by investors and potentially among companies. And I'm someone who's been somewhat critical of the FDA's implementation or continued implementation of the FDAMA provisions, accelerated approval, fast track, all those provisions. And even if the breakthrough therapies is just a re-articulation and a reinvigoration of those principles and those ideas, I think that in and of itself is highly significant, and I would urge people to take it with that view. The other issue, number two, on CMS, the orphan space is obviously on reimbursement, so shifting from regulatory to reimbursement, the orphan space is obviously becoming very crowded, and there's more and more stories in the popular press around whether or not the reimbursement of the orphan products at the orphan pricing is sustainable. I think it's sort of sustainable for the near term, but I think that it's going to continue to get more scrutiny, certainly in the private insurance side where there's very little scrutiny right now paid to it, and even in CMS where there's almost no scrutiny paid to it. I worked at CMS, and the number of times we discussed an orphan drug pricing issue in the administrator's office, and we discussed a lot of product pricing issues in the administrator's office, those decisions often get vetted at that level in that agency, was zero. It never came up. I can't foresee that continuing to be the case going into the future, and I think it calls upon the community to think about how they can look at the orphan space in a more granular fashion and start to think of identifying subgroups within the orphan context that probably deserve more protection around reimbursement. I know that that's exceedingly unpopular from a political standpoint within the orphan community, and that's why I raise it. And the final point I want to make is just around the Affordable Care Act and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. The story when the Affordable Care Act got implemented from the standpoint of sponsors was that there's going to be this, sure, there's new taxes on sponsors and new costs on product developers, but there's going to be all these new customers as a result of people moving into insured schemes. The reality is a lot of those folks were previously getting care. They were just getting it very inefficiently. They didn't have health insurance. They were getting episodic care. I don't think there's going to be as much of a new market, if you will, as there will be people shifting from scenarios where they currently have fairly good comprehensive health insurance to scenarios where their insurance effectively gets degraded. So where they move from the small group market where they have private coverage right now into the exchanges and start getting plans that offer much skinnier options, very high co-insurance if they go out of network or have a catastrophic event. I think that's really going to be the story, and I don't think people have thought through what the implications of that is, and I just want to talk more about that. So those are the 3 points that I want to make here today. On the first point, on the breakthrough therapies pathway, this slide might look familiar to you because I stole it from the FDA. It's the only thing I've ever taken from FDA. But I just wanted to put it up here. I think it was shown in one of the presentations earlier, just to show you how FDA is articulating the breakthrough therapies pathway. A lot of the language that they're using is really around trying to create a different vehicle, different pathway for implementation and application of some of the FDAMA provisions, things like fast track and accelerated approval. I think even if you were to think of the breakthrough therapies pathway from that context, that in and of itself, in my view, is very highly significant because it gives the agency an opportunity to reapply a lot of provisions that had lost their luster inside the agency and apply it in an environment where they'll feel that they have more control over the tools that they're using. But I think that there are a lot of intangible benefits, and I think it means much more than just a reapplication of the FDAMA provisions. On the one hand, what you're seeing sponsors get is very senior level involvement in the breakthrough therapies or in the products that get this designation. You're often seeing very senior level folks from the divisions and even from at the center level sitting in on meetings, taking an active interest in the development process. That obviously has significant, there's no ledge on this podium, that's my problem here. That has significant implications, I think, for sponsors. As I said before, recodification of the FDAMA provisions, really with a new imperative, new direction from Congress. Congress saying to the FDA, we want you to start implementing these, taking more risk in how you work with sponsors to develop drugs, risk that the ultimate trial isn't going to yield all the information with all the certainty around efficacy that you want, but it's important to get these therapies to the market. And FDA was very mindful that they didn't want in the breakthrough therapies a new articulation of a new standard for approval. Really, the standard for approval as it's defined in the statute is just substantial evidence. All the practices around two well randomized clinical trials, all the things FDA talks about in terms of the standard for approval. Really, those are creations and regulations. So the FDA does have a lot of flexibility, and there's been some recent papers, including one by a former colleague, Colleen Klassmeyer, looking at how much flexibility they've taken, especially in the oncology space, with how they've applied this so-called single standard. And I think the breakthrough therapies allows them to take even more license with that. A mandate to try to accelerate development, tolerate more uncertainty, as I said. And there's also discrete benefits. In the oncology space, Rick Pazder has said publicly to audiences that products that get a breakthrough therapies designation probably won't go before an advisory committee, or won't go before an advisory committee subject to, obviously, things becoming of issue later in the process where they might think they need the intervention or the advice of an advisory committee. So that's a very tangible benefit. And I will say Dr. Paz has been very proactive about going out and talking to sponsors and actually inviting them in to explore the breakthrough therapies pathway. And he said that there's about a dozen products that have been given that designation, not all of which have been announced yet. I think a lot of the sponsors who are getting the designation haven't announced it publicly, although you saw a couple announce it recently, because they don't know exactly what it means and they don't know how to talk about it to investors yet. And so there's a lot of trepidation about how you go out and articulate that you've gotten it. And finally, it's been, as I said, Rick's been more aggressive about trying to seek out products where this designation could apply. It's really been division by division. Some divisions have been more proactive, more aggressive about implementation of it and using the measures afforded by the new pathway to try to accelerate development than others. I think there's going to be sort of a shaking out. We're going to get a sense of which divisions have interpreted this differently than others, and there'll be some standardization. FDA will, the Center will put in place some framework at the center level to try to get some standardization, harmonization, if you will, between different divisions, how they apply these new provisions. And this is just some quotes from Bob Temple, kind of re-articulating what I said, but it just gets to the point that from the feedback I've gotten, and it's obviously anecdotal, but it's anecdotal, as many as 5 sponsors, the sponsors that are getting this designation are seeing Janet Woodcock, John Jenkins, some of the senior, Doug Throckmorton, others, Rachel Berman, take an interest in the applications in the development program, and that has unquantifiable benefits, I think, to try to get in place a good development program, good agreement with the agency. I wanted to also talk about the reimbursement challenges, and that was really the balance of my remarks here today. And the first point, just on all orphans created the same when it comes to a reimbursement standpoint, I think that the industry needs to think about how they start talking about subcategories of orphan products if they think that reimbursement is going to be a challenge. Thinking about the orphan drugs as sort of a homogenous space of high-priced drugs invites the reimbursement authorities who are going to start potentially pushing back against subcategories of these products to push back against the whole spectrum, if you will, and try to apply some of the tools that they've used around other categories of products, around the specialty tier products. We really don't see aggressive tiering and other formulary tools that they've used with other product categories. And look at issues like whether or not the inherited disorders, for example, really are a special class that should be protected. People who have an orphan disease as a result of an inherited disorder like the MPS diseases or other categories of diseases like that, really whether or not insurance should be protecting the most vulnerable people who were born with some congenital condition and are going to face very difficult course and very high costs regardless of what we do just because of the nature of the disease, and try to carve out those things for some special protections. I think that there are reasonable chances politically from a policy standpoint to do that, and if I were a sponsor working in one of those categories, I'd start thinking about how to talk about the products a little bit differently to create a little bit of differentiation within the whole broad class of orphan products before there's pushback against the whole category around some of the pricing issues. 340B is going to be, I think, an increasingly big issue for this category, especially the oncology products, where we're seeing very significant gaming by the hospitals to use 340B as a revenue center, moving the delivery of outpatient infused drugs to the inpatient setting to try to capture the spread and be able to bill the government the full freight and then sell it under the 340B pricing and capture that delta, if you will. This is, as I said, being gained by the hospitals. We see hospitals like Duke and Cedars-Sinai, hospitals that were never thought of as indigent care hospitals, qualifying for 340B pricing. And I think that that's going to be a trend that continues because it's a way to try and get more revenue to the hospitals with no cost to the taxpayers, if you will, unless you believe that pharmaceutical pricing. It ultimately gets reflected in the final price of products to people who are fully insured, which it does, of course, from an economic standpoint, but it's not obvious to Congress. And so this has been a preferred vehicle to try to get more revenue to the hospitals. And as the hospitals see their reimbursement come down under deficit reduction measures, I think Congress is going to be looking for things like this, schemes like this, that can help give some of that revenue back in a cost-neutral way from a tax standpoint. And the final point I wanted to make was just about the Affordable Care Act, PPACA, and the issue of a degradation of coverage. We're seeing a lot of categories of insured patients move into schemes where they're going to be in less robust insured arrangements. Medicare dual eligibles who previously were getting a Medicare benefit are now moving into state Medicaid programs, essentially, under the Duals Demonstration Project. I wrote an article recently how children on S-CHIP are being effectively forcibly moved into Medicaid plans under the Affordable Care Act. And in the small group market, we're seeing people move from the small group market into the exchanges, where the insurance isn't going to be quite as robust. The exchange-based coverage is going to be a lot of first dollar coverage, a lot of mandated coverage for routine primary care, but because premiums are capped, because the margins are capped, the plans are going to have to make up that cost someplace. And they're probably going to make up that cost with very tight control of the networks that they offer people, tight control of the providers that you can go to, and a lot of co-insurance on the back end when you go outside of network or you reach catastrophic costs and you try to go to access specialty care. So it's going to be a thinning out of the insurance. And in fact, when you talk to the plans, they're calling these exchange-based coverage Medicaid Plus. So if you believe, like I do, that the individual market the existing individual market and small group market is going to move automatically into the exchanges, you could see a lot of people who get fairly robust coverage right now in the private market moving into a much thinner Medicaid-like plan that has a Medicaid-like formulary. And that's going to have real implications for patients. I think it behooves people who are working in orphan categories to try to build into the regulations right now some kind of mechanism for risk adjustment or other tools like that where the plans could be held harmless for having a lot of patients that are going to cost a lot of money with some of these very expensive disorders. There's really hasn't been a lot of thought to that, and so far HHS has been resistant. The Department of Health and Human Services has been resistant to implementing regulations that would bind the exchange-based plans around some of these issues, risk adjust for some of these patients because they know it's going to drive up premiums, it's going to cost money. But I think it's going to be very important if we want to protect these patients. Likewise, the advent of accountable care organizations and just a consolidation of providers around these integrated delivery systems, which is another thing that's being created by the Affordable Care Act. If you're a provider taking care of, let's say, sickle cell patients, although it's not an orphan disease, I just use it as an example, the accountable care organizations aren't going to go out and recruit you because you're taking care of very high-cost patients that the institutions lose money on. And I think it's likewise with a lot of these orphan diseases where it's not going to be profitable for the integrated delivery system to have these patients in the integrated delivery system. They're not going to go out and recruit these physicians, and so these physicians are going to sit outside these integrated delivery systems, and that again I think could put these patients at a disadvantage. So we need to start thinking through these things. There's going to be a lot of dislocations created by the Affordable Care Act. Programs like Ryan White and other kinds of special needs programs might go away as those patients also move into the exchanges, so we need to think about what the implications are of that. I don't think all those things are fully talked about. People were sort of heading into the advent of the Affordable Care Act and the date of full implementation this fall without really thinking what the implications are going to be for these kinds of patients who have special needs. So with that, I'd like to end. I have some time for questions, but I think I got you guys back on time. Thanks.